I have heard a great many stories told across ranch country, and most of them follow the shape you expect. The land, the weather, the slow wearing down of people who stayed too long in one place. But every so often I hear one that goes the other direction entirely, and this is one of those. Meredith Crane told the man standing beside her at the loading gate of the Aldgate stockyards exactly what she intended to tell him, which was everything, delivered without apology and in plain order. She had that habit. Plain delivery, no softening around the edges, and it had cost her considerably over the years in a town that preferred its women to arrive at difficult topics by way of a long circling approach rather than directly through the front door. The man was Conrad Hale, and he had just asked with no particular ceremony whether he might drive her back to her place when she was done at the yards that afternoon. He asked it the way a man asks for directions, simply without performing anything. Meredith had looked at him for a moment, and then she said what she said. "Before you commit to that, Mr. Hale, I should tell you that there are 7 men in this town who've already decided I'm more trouble than I'm worth. I'd rather you hear that from me now than hear it from someone else later, and wonder what it means." Conrad Hale leaned against the gatepost and said 7. 7. He considered that for what felt like a long time but was probably 10 seconds. Then he said, "I'd like to hear about them if you're willing to tell it." Meredith Crane looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she is trying to determine whether his interest is genuine curiosity, or the kind of performance that collapses the moment it becomes inconvenient. She did not find performance. She found something more unusual in her experience. A man who appeared to actually want to know. She said, "I'll tell you on the drive then, it takes some time." To understand why Meredith Crane kept such a careful accounting of her own rejections, you have to understand what it cost a woman to run 340 acres alone in southern Alberta, in the years after her father died, when she was 31, and everyone in Aldgate privately assumed she would sell the land within the season and move closer to her sister in Lethbridge. She did not sell. She stayed, learned what she didn't know, hired 2 good hands to help her through the first 2 years, and by the time she was 34, she had turned a struggling cattle operation into something that consistently made its payments and occasionally did better than that. The land was hers. The decisions were hers. The mistakes were hers, and so were the corrections. What she had not expected was how thoroughly her competence would narrow the field of men who found her interesting in the way that led anywhere. She had grown up watching her mother defer to her father on every practical matter. Not because her mother was incapable. Meredith understood now, looking back, that her mother was sharper than her father in nearly every way that mattered. But because that was the understood arrangement, and her mother had been formed by it so early that she had likely stopped noticing the shape of it long before Meredith was old enough to see it clearly. Meredith had spent her childhood watching that particular arrangement and filing it away as something she did not intend to replicate, which was a reasonable private decision, and entirely her own business until, one by one, the men of Aldgate made it their business too. Conrad Hale's own history, which Meredith did not yet know, had made him the particular kind of man who could sit in a truck cab on a dirt road in September and listen to a woman account for 7 separate rejections, without feeling the need to defend his gender or soften the accounting. He had grown up the second of 3 sons on a leased spread north of Aldgate, and had watched his father mistake his mother's practicality for a challenge his entire childhood. His mother was the one who read the contracts before signing. She was the one who noticed the error in the equipment lease 2 years running and said so quietly, at the kitchen table, and watched her husband take that information downtown and present it as his own discovery. She was the one who kept the real books, the ones she showed Conrad once when he was 17, and old enough to understand what he was looking at. Separate from the official books his father presented to the bank, she was not bitter about it, which Conrad had found more disturbing somehow than bitterness would have been. She had simply arranged her competence around the available space, the way water arranges itself around stone, and the stone had gotten all the credit for the shape of the river. Conrad had left home at 19, worked cattle across 3 provinces, and returned to Aldgate at 38 because the country suited him, and because he had no illusions about what he was looking for in a life, which was not comfort exactly but something closer to honesty. Here is the thing neither of them could see yet, sitting in that truck with the September light flat across the stubble fields. Meredith had spent 7 rejections, concluding that the right man would have to learn to overlook her independence. Conrad had spent 20 years concluding that a woman's apparent self-sufficiency was usually either a genuine asset or the careful result of years of a man having made it unsafe to be anything else. He had no way yet of knowing which was true of Meredith Crane. He suspected, from what little he knew of her, that it was the former. She began with the first name. Neal Harte had courted her for 5 weeks the spring after her father's death, before withdrawing when he discovered, during a visit to the ranch, that Meredith had already arranged the seasonal grazing permits herself and filed the necessary paperwork without consulting him or anyone else. He had told her, politely enough, that he was looking for a partnership in which a man's guidance was wanted, and that her apparent self-direction left little room for the kind of role he intended to fill. Conrad said, without much hesitation, "Neal Harte has refiled his own grazing permits wrong 3 years running. His brother corrects them before they go to the office, and Neal lets him do it without acknowledgement. I suspect what he meant by guidance was the permission to manage things less capably than you were already managing them yourself." The second name was Douglas Pryce, the feed merchant's son, who had courted Meredith for just under 2 months before ending it, citing her habit of negotiating feed prices directly with suppliers, rather than purchasing through his family's store, which he had called disloyal to local business and unbecoming in a woman he was considering seriously. Conrad said, "Douglas Pryce's family store has been marking up certified feed 22% above the co-op price for 4 years. The people in this valley who can't afford to comparison shop are the ones who pay for it. I find it difficult to fault a woman for doing arithmetic, and considerably easier to fault a man who called it disloyalty rather than intelligence." The third name was Vernon Stull, who had never formally pursued Meredith at all, but had made his opinion of her known at a Rotary Club dinner loudly enough that it became the general understanding of the town that a woman who ran her own land and kept her own counsel was the kind of woman who would make any man's life a misery, and that Aldgate's bachelors would be wise to look elsewhere. Conrad said, after a pause, "Vernon Stull's wife has not attended a public function in 2 years without his written approval of her outfit. I would not take his definition of misery as an authoritative source." Meredith had not heard her own accounting examined this way before. Each man's stated reason turned back over, one case at a time, to reveal less about her failure and more about the specific anxiety of the man doing the refusing. She found, sitting in that truck cab watching the road unspool ahead of them, that something she had been carrying braced and tight in her chest for 3 years was beginning very slowly to ease. She had expected when she started the list that Conrad would eventually arrive at some version of the same conclusion. He had not yet. She was on the fourth name. The fourth and fifth she gave together. Since their complaints had been nearly identical, Len Carver and Phil Doucette, both of whom had shown interest briefly within the same calendar year, and both of whom had withdrawn, citing, in almost the same words, that a woman who contradicted a man's estimate of his own cattle at a public sale was an embarrassment no husband in the district would tolerate. Conrad said, "I was at the Carver sale when that happened. Len had the yearlings priced $30 a head above what the market would bear, and you told him so before the auctioneer started. You were right by the time the gavel came down. I remember thinking at the time that a man who couldn't hear good advice from the person giving it was going to spend a considerable amount of money learning it from the market instead." He paused. "I don't recall Len thanking you." He did not. "Phil Doucette's operation has been in the red for 2 years. I know because he told me himself and seemed surprised, as if the numbers had arrived without cause." The sixth name was the one that gave Conrad pause. It was Ben Aldgate, no relation to the town, though the coincidence of names had always struck Meredith as ironic, who had courted her the longest of anyone on the list, 8 months, and who had genuinely seemed for most of that time to see her the way she wished to be seen. He had ended it, finally, by telling her that he had spoken to his father and his 2 older brothers, and that the family consensus was that a woman who ran her own land, and had no intention of folding it into a shared operation, was a woman who would never truly be a Aldgate in the way his family required. He had said he was sorry. He had looked like he meant it. Conrad was quiet for longer than he had been for any of the previous names. Then he said, "I won't condemn Ben Aldgate the way I've condemned the others, because I think he was genuinely sorry and I think the choice was harder for him than the result looked. But I will say that a man who loves a woman and then asks his father's permission to stop, that is a particular kind of weakness I have troubles respecting, even when I can understand the shape of the difficulty." Meredith said, "That's the fairest thing anyone has ever said about Ben to me. Most people either excuse him entirely or call him a coward. You've managed something between those two." Conrad said, "I try to be accurate. It seems to me the whole problem with how this town has treated you is that nobody bothered to be accurate. Everyone accepted the refuser's account without asking whether the refuser had something he was protecting." The seventh name was Raymond Fovell, a cattle buyer from Red Deer who had corresponded with Meredith for nearly 7 months. Long considered letters that had seemed at the time like the beginning of something genuine, before appearing in Aldgate one September and revealing, casually, as though it were a minor administrative detail, that he had been engaged for the past year to a woman in Calgary, and that his letters to Meredith had been, in his words, a pleasant way to think through ideas during a busy travel season. Conrad's expression changed when she said that name. Not dramatically, He was not a man given to dramatic expressions, but something in the set of his jaw hardened in a way none of the previous 6 had produced. He said, "That one isn't a rejection at all. That's just a lie sustained over 7 months. And I'll tell you honestly, Miss Crane, I'm angrier hearing that name than all 6 of the others put together, because every one of those men refused you for reasons you could at least examine and account for. He never refused you. He just used your correspondence for his own comfort and let you discover the truth by accident. That's a different category of wrong entirely." Meredith said quietly. "It was the one that took longest to stop affecting how I read people. The others I could understand even when I disagreed with their reasoning. Raymond never gave me a reason. He just disappeared into a wedding announcement in the Red Deer Advocate that someone was kind enough to mail me without a return address." Conrad said nothing for a moment. The truck slowed behind a cattle trailer on the county road, and he waited for it to clear a gate before he spoke again. "I've now heard all 7. And I'll tell you what I notice, having listened to the whole accounting." He said it slowly, the way a man speaks when he wants to be heard accurately rather than quickly. "Neal feared you'd notice he didn't know what he was doing. Douglas feared you'd notice he was overcharging people who trusted him. Vernon wanted a wife who required managing, and found one. Len and Phil both asked you for information they needed, got it, and then punished you for being right. Ben loved you and didn't love you enough to say so when it cost him something. And Raymond was never honest with you at all." He paused. 7 names. Every single one of them describes a man's limitation. Not one of them tells me anything true about you. Meredith Crane sat in the passenger seat of Conrad Hale's truck in the late September afternoon light, listening to her own carefully maintained ledger of old wounds, read back to her in a completely different order than the one she had always carried them in, and found she had no argument to make against a single word of it. They reached the turnoff to her property, and Conrad slowed the truck without being asked, which meant he had either been to her place before, or had been paying enough attention to know the road. She did not ask which. She said, "Why did you ask to drive me home today, Mr. Hale? You must have heard some version of this list before. Aldgate isn't big enough for it to have stayed entirely quiet." He said, "I heard the general shape of it, not the particulars. The particulars, now that I've heard them, have told me something I suspected at a distance but couldn't be certain of, that this town made a consistent error about you and called it consensus." He turned off the engine at the edge of her yard. "I watched my mother spend 30 years in a marriage where her intelligence was treated as an inconvenience. I promised myself early that I wouldn't repeat my father's way of doing things. When I started hearing the way Aldgate talked about you, too capable, too direct, too much of her own person, I kept thinking those sounded less like warnings and more like a description of exactly the kind of woman I'd stopped believing I'd actually find in a place like this." Meredith looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I accept the drive home, Mr. Hale, and if you want to come inside for coffee, I'll tell you about the book I'm currently reading on soil management in semi-arid climates. It is almost certainly less interesting to you than it is to me, but I've learned that's a useful thing to find out early." Conrad said, "I have some questions about overgrazing patterns. I've been meaning to ask someone who's worked this particular soil. I suspect we might be reading different chapters of the same problem." He was right. They talked for 3 hours that evening, and when Conrad finally drove back down her lane in the dark, Meredith, mother, who had been visiting from Lethbridge and had watched the conversation from the kitchen doorway, with the careful, undemonstrative hope that prairie women learn to carry very quietly, said only, "He stayed." Meredith said, "He asked about the soil management book, all 3 chapters I've read so far." Her mother said, "Good." That was enough, from a woman who had learned to measure hope in small and accurate units. Conrad Hale and Meredith Crane were married 11 months later at the Aldgate Community Hall, in a ceremony that drew considerably more of the town than either of them expected, curiosity and genuine goodwill having arrived in roughly equal proportions. Neal Harte attended and said nothing of consequence. Douglas Pryce sent a card. Vernon Stull did not come, which suited Meredith well enough. Ben Aldgate came, shook Conrad's hand, and told Meredith quietly that he was glad for her, and she believed him. Raymond Fauvel was not in Aldgate and had not been for 3 years. Meredith kept her ledger as she had always kept it. The entries after her wedding changed in character. No longer a protective accounting of old refusals, but a private record of things worth remembering. A good season, an argument settled fairly, the particular quality of light on the south pasture in October. A marriage conducted entirely without the 8th entry she had once suspected she would eventually need to make. She ran the ranch. Conrad ran the adjacent lease he acquired the year after their wedding, and they worked the combined operation with the kind of practical honesty that comes from 2 people who never learned to pretend for the sake of appearances. When she was right, she said so. When he was right, she said that too. The accounts stayed clear. The cattle did well most years and less well in others, and neither of them blamed the other for the weather. 3 of the 7 men eventually said something to her that resembled an apology, each arriving at it years after the fact and by different routes, having watched their own lives resolve in ways that made Conrad's early reading of them look, in hindsight, rather more accurate than any of them had found comfortable at the time. Douglas Pryce was the first, after the co-op pricing became public knowledge in a way that cost him 2 major supply contracts, and forced a reckoning with the corner-cutting Gideon had identified years before. He did not apologize exactly, but he said to Meredith at the feed store one afternoon that he understood now why she had bought direct, and that he wished he had run a different kind of operation. She accepted that as the closest he could manage and did not require more. Ben Aldgate was the second, arriving at the ranch one evening 5 years later, with his hat in his hands and a quiet, genuine admission that he had chosen the easier path and had spent considerable time since then, understanding what that choice had cost him. Not in terms of her, he said carefully, since she had clearly found better, but in terms of what it had revealed about the kind of man he had been at that particular moment. Meredith thanked him for coming and meant it. The 7th name, Raymond Fauvel, never appeared. She did not expect him to. There is a particular kind of wisdom that comes from keeping careful records. Not the kind kept for grievance, but the kind kept for clarity. Meredith Crane understood early that a precise accounting of what had actually happened was the only reliable protection against the stories other people tried to tell about why things went the way they did. Conrad Hale understood it differently, not from keeping records himself, but from watching, for his whole childhood, what happened to a woman whose records were never read by anyone who mattered, until the story of her life got told by the people who had the most interest in a particular version of events. Between the 2 of them, they got the story right. I have been turning that particular thought over for some time now. The idea that a list of refusals only tells you what you need to know if the right person finally reads it honestly. Most lists get read by people with reasons to see them a certain way. It takes someone with no stake in the old version of events to simply look at what is actually there. Tell me this, if you're willing. Of the 7 men in Meredith's accounting, which one do you think revealed the most about himself in the reason he gave? And which one do you think she was right to feel something closer to sadness about than anger?